is the 2022 Subaru Outback Wilderness. And it's a Subaru Outback that's rugged. It's got more ground clearance than a regular Outback and a few more off-road features, plus sort of more muscular styling for people who want a little more SUV with their Outback. And today, I'm going to review it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era, now with free listings. You can list your cool modern enthusiast car on Cars and Bids and auction it for free. And we've had some great sales recently on Cars and Bids, including this Ram TRX, which sold for over $105,000, this Range Rover Sport SVR, which sold for $63,000, and this fantastic Mercedes S600 Coupe, which brought just under $20,000. I love those. If you're interested in selling or buying a cool car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. We have daily auctions and great selection of cool modern enthusiast cars at carsandbids.com. So let's talk Wilderness. The latest Subaru Outback went on sale for the 2020 model year, and it follows the same formula the Outback always has. It's sort of a wagon alternative to an SUV for people who want a more car-like driving experience. Well, now there's the Wilderness, which is sort of an SUV version of the Outback, which is kind of strange because that makes it an SUV version of a wagon version of an SUV. It's a bit weird. And it looks a bit weird too. As you can see, this doesn't look like a regular Outback. It has a lot of plastic around the wheel arches and the bumpers, front and rear, intended to be damaged when you're out on the trails. The Outback Wilderness also has an extra inch of ground clearance compared to the regular Outback, along with a few other upgrades, off-road cosmetic changes that I'll show you. Now, I've already reviewed the regular Outback, so today I'm just going to focus on the Wilderness, the pros and cons, and the changes to the Wilderness compared to the standard Outback. So, first I'll take you on a little tour and show you the quirks and features of the Wilderness. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Wilderness. Now, like I said, I already reviewed the regular Outback and in greater detail. I'm going to link that review in the description below so you can check it out if you're interested in the more general Outback. In this video, I'm just going to cover the Wilderness and some of the changes for this car, starting with some of the stuff you can see right now. And first, the wheels. Now, a regular Outback at this price point has 18-inch wheels. In this car, they've actually been downsized to 17-inch wheels because that allows them to fit these tires. These are all-terrain tires, better, grippier off-road, since that's where people will be using this. You can still use them on the street, no problem, but they can really do more off-road thanks to additional grip. And you can see they've faced the white letters of these tires out, just to make sure you know this is the more rugged and off-roady Outback. Gives it a more muscular look. Now, also visible from here is probably this car's most notable change compared to the regular Outback. It has more ground clearance. Subaru gave it an extra inch of ground clearance over the standard Outback for a total of around 9.5 inches of ground clearance, which is impressive. That's the same figure as a Toyota 4Runner, and that's like a serious off-road SUV. This is just like a little crossover family wagon, and they have the same clearance. But don't go thinking your Outback Wilderness is going to be as capable off-road as a 4Runner or some other purpose-built SUV. Cars like that have more advanced four-wheel drive systems, usually with extra features like a locking differential or some sort of terrain control system that the Outback Wilderness doesn't have. And you're going to get penalized when you go off-roading with your Outback Wilderness in terms of approach angle. Purpose-built SUVs typically have their wheels at the corner of their bodies, so there's not much bodywork between the tire and the front of the car. This allows them to climb steep obstacles. Well, the Outback Wilderness wasn't really designed for that. It has big overhangs and the approach angles aren't great. 20-degree approach angle in the front compared to 33 degrees for the 4Runner, so this isn't going to climb really steep hills or trails, even though it does have the ground clearance. And there are other important off-roader features on the outside of the Outback Wilderness. One is a skid plate mounted kind of under the front bumper in case you do try to tackle a steep hill or a big rock. You have a skid plate there to kind of armor the car in front to protect it from getting damaged, which is nice to have. You also have these roof racks that are heavily beefed up compared to the standard ones in an Outback. Subaru says these can handle up to 700 pounds when the car is sitting still. That means you can camp on them. You can set up a tent on your roof racks and then sleep up there in case you don't want to be on the forest floor with all the scary animals. That's a pretty cool feature, although the roof racks can hold less weight when the car is actually in motion. As for the rest of the exterior upgrades to the Outback Wilderness, they're mostly cosmetic. From here you can easily see the most visually obvious, and that would be the black plastic cladding all around the exterior of this car. This black stuff around the wheel arches, and you can see it in the front bumper, a lot of black plastic which is painted on the regular Outback, same deal on the rear bumper, a lot of black plastic here. The intent for this is so that if you damage it when you're out on the trails, it doesn't scratch your paint, you have to repaint a panel, you can just pop on a new piece of black plastic trim. And as a result, it's intended to give it kind of a tougher look as a vehicle that's built for getting scratched and damaged. But frankly, I think it makes it look kind of weird, actually, all this black trim. It's a little strange looking from the outside. I don't really love how it looks, but it's at least a little functional. But the rest of the exterior upgrades pretty much are all for show. One of them is the gold accents. Gold accents, kind of a theme in this car on the outside and on the inside, as I will show you. You can see two of the gold accents here on the front bumper, and you can see more on the side of the car. On the roof rails, you see gold accents there, and the Outback logo in the back door trimmed in gold, only for the Wilderness model. Same deal in back. You can see a few more gold accents all around this car, I guess, to distinguish it from a standard Outback. Also distinguishing it from a normal Outback is the badging, which is pretty large. In the back, you have this Subaru Wilderness badge, quite large and quite brightly colored, and that badge also appears on both front doors. So both sides of this car, it says Subaru Wilderness, again, to emphasize your wilderness-ness. Also worth noting that this exterior color is only on the Wilderness model. It's not offered on the regular Outback. It's called Geyser Blue to try to evoke feelings of being in the wilderness, and you can only get it if you get the Wilderness. And next up we climb inside the Outback Wilderness, and the cosmetic stuff continues in here. There's a lot of it. For one thing, on the floor mats, you can again see this Subaru Wilderness logo along with a graphic depicting rocks, I guess like mountains, to emphasize the wilderness-ness. Also in here is a lot of that gold trim I mentioned from the outside carried into the inside. For instance, the gear selector is trimmed in gold to match the Wilderness theme. Same deal with the steering wheel. Again, you have this gold trim at the bottom, and the stitching in here is entirely in gold. The seat stitching is in gold, as you can see. The stitching on the door panel is gold, and even around the gear selector at the base, you have gold stitching. Also on the center console armrest, again, all to match the Wilderness theme. And in case you forget just how wildernessy your Subaru is, you are reminded in several places. There's this little tag on the door panel. You can see Subaru Wilderness is stitched in there. That's driver and passenger side, of course. And the front headrests also have this Subaru Wilderness logo. Again, just to make sure no matter where you look, you'll see some wilderness. Now, I will say, while most of the changes in the interior of the Wilderness are cosmetic, there are some actual important upgrades here for the off-roady model. One is back to the floor mats. You can see they are rubber. Instead of your typical carpeted floor mats, you get these front and in the back also rubber floor mats. Of course, you're going off-roading, mudding, whatever. You get muddy here, so you have rubber floor mats, which is nice. They're easier to clean. You also have extra drive modes here. Subaru's drive mode system has been reworked to give you even more off-road options, as you can see, so you can take this deeper off-road. And Subaru says the transmission has been reworked just a little bit to make the car easier to drive at lower speeds. So like if you're crawling on a trail at low speeds, the transmission has been designed to kind of accommodate that and make it a little bit more comfortable than a typical Outback where you'll be doing most of your driving at higher speeds, of course. One other cool feature in here, the leather upholstery, as you can see, isn't actually leather. It's synthetic leather, which of course is better for the animals. And there's a cool feature feature here, even the back of the rear seats is trimmed in this synthetic leather. Usually that's carpeted, but in this car it's trimmed in the leather, so when you put the back seats down and your muddy stuff gets on top of them, a dog or a bike, it's easier to clean off that synthetic leather than it is to clean off the carpet that's usually there, which is a nice touch for the wilderness. Now, next up, even though I'm mostly covering just wilderness highlights in this video, I do want to talk about the infotainment system in this car, even though I already discussed it in my regular Outback video, just because it's such an important part of these cars. You can see here it's a huge screen in the Wilderness, a big vertical screen oriented like a phone, kind of upright, and it has a lot of information on it. I find this screen pretty easy to use, although I will say it's not quite as responsive and a little bit more laggy than the best screens from rival brands that I've seen. I'm also a little bit disappointed about just how much stuff has been integrated into this screen. For instance, your auto start stop feature where the car shuts off at a traffic light. If you want to turn that off in most cars, you just press a button. In this car, it's a button in the screen. Same deal with the drive modes. You want to change into one of those off-roady drive modes. There's no like little dial U-turn like in every other car. Instead, you got to go into the screen, into the drive mode menu, and only there can you select your modes, which kind of complicates the process. Same deal with the climate controls. You can adjust the air temperature of the climate controls with these hard buttons next to the screen, but everything else you have to go into the screen for, including turning on the heated seat. You got to tap the seat icon, then tap the heater button, and it just complicates a process that everyone else makes easy with an actual physical control to turn on the heated seat. With that said, generally speaking, this is a good infotainment system. It's big, it's easy to use, easy to understand, and I think most of the people who buy this car will be happy with it. A few little drawbacks, but mostly, generally, it's pretty good. And finally, let's move under the hood and talk engine. Now, the regular Outback is offered with a choice between two engines. You can get a normal 4-cylinder with about 180 horsepower, or you can choose a turbo 4-cylinder with 260 horsepower. The Wilderness model is only offered with the turbocharged engine, so 260 horsepower, pretty muscular, can get you anywhere you want to go quickly on or off the pavement. But this extra power, standard in the Wilderness, also comes with a price bump. There's no such thing as a truly base model, kind of cheap Wilderness, because it doesn't even come with the base engine. An Outback with its cheapest engine will start around $27,000. This, the Wilderness, starts around $36,000, and this car is equipped to around $40,000 with options. Frankly, I think that's still a pretty good number considering all this car offers, but don't go into the Subaru dealer thinking you'll be able to find some stripped down Outback with just the Wilderness off-road goodies. It doesn't exist. You got to get the big engine, and it comes with other stuff to increase the price. All right, driving the Outback Wilderness. Now, I gotta say, I grew up in Colorado, and I was living there when the Outback first came out in the mid-90s, and it was just a Subaru wagon with like a little extra ground clearance and sort of an off-road kind of marketing, honestly, and that blew up. And it's amazing what this car has gotten itself into. These days, if you live out west, here in California, but also Utah, Oregon, Colorado, it's become a big trend to kind of off-roadify Subarus, the Outback, the Crosstrek, the Forester, and so I'm not really that surprised that Subaru has gone into this market themselves with an off-roadified Subaru from the factory. So from a driving perspective, two things kind of surprised me. One is there's not much tire noise. You know, when you add all-terrain tires, you usually kind of get saddled with like a loud, annoying tire, and I think that's gonna send a lot of people thinking, maybe I shouldn't buy this car. Don't not buy it because of that. It actually is pretty quiet when you're in the car driving it, and I'm surprised to say that because I was expecting it to be notably louder, but it isn't really. Now that may speak to the fact that the tires aren't really all that aggressive of an off-road tire, but regardless, it's gonna be better than a regular pavement tire, even if it's not quite as off-roady as it could be, and it's relatively quiet around town. The other thing that I've noticed that I'm a little surprised about is the car doesn't feel any more ponderous, you know, in terms of steering, handling, whatever. With an inch higher ground clearance, 9.5 inches is a pretty big number, but this still drives and feels just like an Outback does. You don't really feel it. It certainly doesn't feel tippy or anything like that. Not that I was really expecting it to. I know that an extra inch of ground clearance isn't a really big deal, but I think some of the people who are buying this car maybe have trepidations about buying SUVs for their height. Well, this car doesn't really, it doesn't feel like an SUV, it still feels like an Outback. Now, the flip side of that is an interesting thing. It doesn't have great high seating position. A lot of the reason people buy crossovers is because they sit above stuff, and they like that. Another inch ground clearance doesn't really make the Outback feel like that. You still don't have an SUV driving position, even though you do have SUV ground clearance. It still feels lower than that and sort of more kind of small crossover-y. Truthfully, otherwise, there's not much kind of new and exciting to report with this car. I reviewed the regular Outback back when it came out, I think in late 2019, and it was good. You know, I mean, these aren't incredibly exciting or interesting cars. This one is obviously more interesting and exciting because it's the Wilderness, but there's nothing crazy about them. And aside from the Wilderness stuff, which I went over, the off-road goodies that this car has, it's a lot like a regular Outback. Drives like it, feels like it, from a drivability standpoint, and it's pretty much the same. Interior room's the same, just a few little upgrades. And I think that there are some real benefit to these upgrades. You're not going to be able to take this in serious off-roading. If you have buddies with like a Jeep that go out, you know, this will not keep up with that kind of thing. But if you want to get to a trailhead that's maybe a little difficult to reach, or if you want to go down some muddy roads, you know, whatever, I don't know. This can do a lot of sort of light off-roading that maybe a typical crossover might get stuck or might seem intimidated by. This has that capability. It's not a full-on off-roader, but you're also not making full-on off-roader compromises. It's way more comfortable in here than a Wrangler. You basically get an Outback with a little more off-road prowess and the look of it too. And I think there's a lot of people who want that, and I suspect these will do okay. And so that's the Subaru Outback Wilderness. An SUV-ish version of the Outback seems to kind of defeat the original purpose of the Outback, but you can't really blame Subaru for wanting to cash in on this incredibly hot off-roader market. Anyway, now it's time to give the Outback Wilderness a DOUGSCORE. And the DOUGSCORE is here, 48 out of 100. The Outback Wilderness gets the very same overall score as the Outback XT I reviewed 2 years ago, though the Wilderness has some variation in the individual scores. The Wilderness loses a point for styling, but adds one for fun factor, given its extra capabilities. Ultimately, though, the Wilderness loses big to the true off-road SUVs at the top of this list, the Bronco, the Wrangler, and the 4Runner. So, while the Wilderness provides extra capabilities for a Subaru, you'll want something tougher if you want to do any serious off-roading.